Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Massachusetts and speak with Chris Martinsen of PeakProsperity.com. Chris, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max. It's good to be back.
All right, Chris. In a recent PeakProsperity.com, you write of the 4 signs that we are in a dangerous bubble territory. I'm assuming that means dangerous bubble territory in the stock market. Tell us about it.
Well, it's a dangerous bubble there. It's also a really dangerous bubble in the bond markets, the quantitative easing efforts across the globe, all the central banks, they've driven up asset prices everywhere. Of course, they haven't gotten the growth that they've been looking for. So what do you have? What do you need to have a bubble? Well, you need to have overpriced assets that are well beyond the ability of incomes to sustain them. Where's our income? GDP is not coming back. It's certainly not in Europe, not in Japan, not in the US. And so we've got overbought markets, dangerously overpriced on both the equity and bond side. So if you liked rising stock prices and falling bond yields, you're going to hate the opposite. It feels like that's the shift that we've just gone through here.
Well, Chris, it's interesting because the policy makers in Washington as well as here in the UK, they talk about a recovery. But we haven't seen any recovery in jobs or wages or bank reform or any kind of reforms that we would hope to see. So it's interesting. Can you talk about this misuse of the word recovery? Because they are equating recovery with a bubble. Just like in the UK now, they equate journalism with terrorism. They also now equate bubble with recovery. Those two don't go together, correct?
That's absolutely correct. We've got the very best statistical recovery that trillions of pounds, euros, and dollars can buy, but it's just a statistical recovery. I mean, we're looking at some headline GDP numbers, maybe some corporate earnings, but gosh, you look at the corporate earnings situation, if you peel back the covers just slightly there, you find all kinds of non-GAAP reporting is being allowed now. When you look at unemployment, you peel back the covers slightly, you find out that part-time counts the same as full-time, and that part-time are more than 3/4 of all jobs that have been created, such as they are. When you peel back the covers just a little bit on the underlying economy, you discover that it's really not all that strong. And this is with really, really historic levels of quantitative easing and deficit spending. So we've got monetary policy, fiscal policy. They're both pushing and pulling as hard as they can. It looks like Japan to me for circa 1990 to 2000.
All right, let's talk about Japan for a second, because I really am curious about what's going on there. The Nikkei is up 75% on this massive money printing from the new leadership there. At the same time, they've got the Fukushima nuclear disaster, which has just been upgraded officially by the government. 300 tons of radioactive water being dumped into the Pacific Ocean. People are starting to realize this is a quite an interesting scenario. Is the Fukushima tied? Is there a connection there? Because they've already shut down all their atomic energy plants, and they're incredibly dependent on foreign energy. They have no internal source of energy. Isn't there potentially a pin to prick here? I mean, they've already had 20 years of a zombie economy. Now the Fukushima is really escalating. Where are we at in the cycle of Japan?
Well, you know, economists would like to tell you Fukushima is a good thing because anything destructive is awesome because you get to spend money fixing it. But realistically, Fukushima is going to be an extraordinary drain on resources, partly because they have to import all of this energy to replace the lost nuclear power, but they're going to have to spend a lot more than they have trying to fix that mess that is Fukushima. I've read reports that there are now radioisotopes that are being discovered that are only consistent with fission, meaning that there's some sort of a reaction still occurring, most likely, almost certainly, in whatever that corium mess that's escaped. They don't even really know where the reactor cores are at this point in time. They just know that they've got lots and lots of very, very hot radioactive water leaking out all over the place. They can't contain it. They can't control that. And if they do have continued fission going on, there's no way they're going to be able to cool that down. It's creating more and more heat. It's creating more and more radioactivity. It is, bar none, the biggest industrial disaster we've ever had. It's unfolding. It's continuing to unfold. Even though the media has really largely put it to the side, it's far from fixed, and it's going to take forever. I think Japan, look at them, with over 200% debt to GDP. They're going to have to spend a lot more government money, go into debt further to try and fix this thing, and they're going to get really no benefit economically for that, except maybe in the statistics. But let's call it what it is. It is a complete, continuing disaster.
Okay, well, you mentioned they could go even deeper into debt. But at some point, somebody, one of these sovereigns, is going to be unable to keep this Ponzi scheme going because they're all buying each other's debt as part of this collusion between central banks that are hiding the fact that none of them are generating any internal growth. So they're just buying each other's debt and bailing banks out and creating statistical well-being, even though the underlying economy and the underlying citizens, or in the case of the UK, the underlying subjects, as they're called here, they don't have citizens, they have subjects. Their quality of life is deteriorating, and the real inflation on the ground is going up 7, 8, 9%. So quality of life is collapsing in the UK and around the world. Now, speaking of energy, oil prices are triple digits. In 2008, many argued oil would collapse back to $20 a barrel and stay there. They were, of course, wrong. Are high oil prices going to stay high, in your thought, Chris Martinsen?
Oh, they have to. If they dip much below $80 a barrel, you're going to see a complete cessation of drilling in the so-called miracle shale plays out of North America, which is the only place that shale plays are really being prosecuted at this point. The rest of the world's operating on conventional oil for the most part, as is the U.S. And I mean, to put it in context, what's the U.S. getting? Maybe 1.5 million barrels per day out of shale plays. Nothing to sneeze at, but it's really a drop compared to the more than 80 million barrels a day of oil that's being pumped out and consumed worldwide. Obviously, if we did have a dip in prices, we would see ultra deep water drilling stop. We would see shale plays stop. We would all of a sudden run into a supply squeeze. So the price of oil is really telling us that, yes, supply and demand are kind of balanced out here, and this is what the price has to be. The world is still not producing substantially more oil than it did in 2005. China's consuming more and more every year. So is India. That's the nature of the situation. So if anything, the emergence of the shale plays and all of these heroic drilling efforts tell me that peak oil is a very real phenomenon, and it's here to stay, and we're just going to have to deal with it now.
All right, now, Chris, by shale, you're talking, of course, about fracking. And let's talk about fracking for a second, because they're discovering, for example, in Texas, where you've got huge fracking operations, they have to stop fracking because they ran out of water. So all of the global warming and climate change that burning fossil fuels has created over the past 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years has now evaporated all the water that you would need to frack to get more energy to burn. So you've got this negative feedback loop that looks like what Paul Watson of the Sea Shepherd calls the economics of extinction, which I really like that phrase. But going forward, or looking at this a little bit deeper, Chris, insurance companies are now refusing to provide homeowners insurance to those near fracking wells. So here you have a complete breakdown of the notion of private property, because you can't insure your property anymore, again, because of the unsustainable, unreliable, destructive fracking. Is capitalism about to go bust? Chris, what do you think?
Well, capitalism does rely on endlessly increasing amounts of energy, not just energy, but cheap energy. And one of the things that fracking was supposed to give us was endless quantities of cheap energy. Obviously, we've already talked about it's not cheap, but now we're just starting to see that the PR campaign's wearing off a little bit. Some reality is starting to come back in. We're starting to understand there are real externalities, real costs associated with fracking. There's huge amounts of damage to roads, roadways, infrastructure. Something else that needs to be mentioned is Texas is reverting a whole lot of formerly paved highways to gravel because they can't afford to continue repaving them as these 80,000-pound fracking trucks destroy them. So we're seeing all this infrastructure wear and tear. We're seeing obvious huge impacts on the water use because they're pumping it down for the fracking itself. We're seeing disposal issues of the blowback frack fluids that come back up. Where do they put all that? Sometimes it gets dumped on roads. And now we're actually starting to get first confirmed reports of, yes, fracking does sometimes contaminate wells and ruin properties and the water tables under them. And so, of course, you know, insurance companies, as you mentioned, they love to insure stuff unless they think they're going to have to pay out on those things that they have insured. And they've wised up and said, you know, this is a big risk. We've analyzed it, and we don't think that we can realistically assess this risk. So guess what? These are the same insurance companies that'll insure you if you live in a floodplain, and they've decided they can't take the risk on fracking. That tells you something about where we are in this story. I have to say the level of journalism and reporting and investigation on this, again, much better in the blogosphere than in the mainstream press. The U.S. Department of Energy and the EPA that are supposed to be monitoring these things, I think are doing the same thing they've done with the neonicotinoids and the collapsing bee colonies. They've basically caved into industry side of this whole thing and are telling the industry story. So I guess the insurance companies are giving us an indication of what other corporations think about fracking at this point.
Yeah, I want to stay on fracking for a moment because it's becoming big here in the UK. And the left, or the Greens, as they call themselves, would argue that they're doing damage to the environment and the environment needs to be protected. And then the right wing will say, well, we need to become more energy independent, and we need to make sure people don't suffer fuel poverty during the winter. And they have this debate going on. But what's missing from the debate is that the economics of fracking suck. The amount of energy it takes that goes into fracking, in many cases, what we found in the United States, is greater than the energy you get out. So you have more BTUs, British thermal units, to frack than you're getting out of the ground. So there's a deficit. There's an energy deficit, which is made up with debt. So the debt in the UK is going to go up. Furthermore, it's capital intensive. So if we're heading into peak credit because all these banks need to be bailed out again, there's no money to frack anywhere in the world either. It's a very capital intensive industry. Chris Martinsen.
Well, you've got it exactly right. I think both the Greens and the rights are missing the most important part of this story is, well, listen, even if we agree we're going to go and we're going to frack, we're going to pull out what BTUs we can, hopefully with a slight net positive, where do we want to be when those run out? Because one of the things about the shale plays is they deplete extraordinarily quickly. You take a single well, within 3 years, it's producing maybe 10, maybe 20% of what it was producing when you first opened the wellhead. And so guess what? We can drill like mad. The United States plugged in 25,000 wells last year and managed to keep everything just about horizontal for the year. And so there's this huge effect of just drilling. Hey, if that's fine, we still need to have the conversation, which is we're pouring capital into this. Where do we want to be when these things run out? And they will, just like every finite resource. And that's the conversation piece that's missing. Because if we wanted to drill, pull all this stuff out and build ourselves a new configured society that could live quite peaceably and wonderfully when those remaining fracked items run out, I'd be all for it, but we're not. We're saying we're going to frack so that we can support having more jobs and more SUVs sold next year, more cars in the road because we need more economic growth. It's an ideology. It really has no future. That's the part that drives me nuts in this story.
Chris Martinsen, we are out of time, so we're going to have to say goodbye, but thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and the lovely and talented Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Chris Martinsen of peakprosperity.com. They have fantastic podcasts that I listen to all the time with great guests. If you'd like to get in touch with us, just tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.